Come to my thing. Ah, there we go. I'll have to adjust that as well. Always issues at the last moment. But
Mhm.
welcome to a episode of our game design weekend show. I've gotten a rebranding thanks to Ken in terms of getting some templates made up. So we're going to be calling it the Key to Games podcast. But for the locals here, will be known as the Josh Cast for our weekend shows. But each week we are talking game design topics as well as game dev. And if you'd like to suggest a topic for a future show, please get in touch.
Please.
But I'm, of course, Josh Placer from Game Wisdom, and joining me as my co host is indie game developer Joshua Reyes.
Thank you. Thank you as always, Josh. Looking forward to today's discussion. It's going to be a good one. I
Hmm?
feel it.
Yep, I am sure. And I am hoping that internet stays stable. We're having winter
This,
storm alerts around here,
yeah,
so who knows?
who knows? Who knows?
But our topic for this week is going to be talking about level design, specifically giving levels personality, making them memorable. Because this is something that can oftentimes be what separates good and bad, or actually good to amazing games, I
Amazing.
should say.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
because if you're going to below that, it's just bad level design, and then it's good, and then amazing, right? There's not a
mhm,
lot of in between, right, Josh?
yeah. And hey, Chris, thanks for, I guess, listening to us on the car. Hopefully, it's not still snowing in Texas where you're at. But yeah, and it's oftentimes very hard to know what makes a really great level. We've had jokes in the past about just be Nintendo and all your levels will be fine. But
Yeah.
Even Nintendo has certainly had to do a lot of work to get level design right. And
Mhm.
when we talk about this, we're kind of focusing on reflex or action based games because in a turn based or RPG setting, you're
Baldur's
not
Gate, right?
you're not thinking about level design the same way as this. And hi Amanda. And this definitely requires a combination of both environmental and level design. And what we mean by this is that environmental design is designing the tone, the aesthetics of a level. So this would be on my thumbnail, this would be a good example of everything from Demon Souls or the Souls games, where
Mhm.
you have something like Anno Lundo, the massive
Yeah.
sun soaked city, unless you go to Dark Anno Lundo, which is
Yeah.
honestly like one of speaking from an environmental standpoint, I love the aesthetics of Dark Anno Lundo. I think
Amazing, amazing. It's the juxtaposition, right,
yeah,
from the original to dark. It's beautiful,
yeah,
because also it's involved in the story and
mm-hmm,
then the way it looks. So it's all there's environmental storytelling.
mm-hmm,
There's all that good stuff going on. Continue, please.
yeah, and it is very much that case of like giving that little that sense of depth. And I still say Dark Anno Lundo would be like the perfect like horror game. Like someone needs to do like a horror game in that kind of city state. Now, the other side, of course, when we talk about level design, this is the obstacles. This is designing what the player is actually going to be doing in that space. So this is when we get to stuff like Buzzsaws Aplenty and Super Meat Boy, the various just crazy tech you have to do in a game like Celeste. Again, pick Blighttown as another. Blighttown will probably be a really good example of both environmental and level design. I
Right.
know there was an interview by the developer a few weeks ago when he was talking about his love of creating like swamp and poison filled areas. Like it's his like dream just to make like the most depressingly difficult poison areas in games. So,
Yeah. Some of the developers are like that.
mm-hmm. And I think he's living the dream. I think no one has come close to like Blighttown and then Blighttown Part Two and Dark Souls Two and
Mhm.
so on. But getting to that point is a very tricky topic. And I think when it comes down to it, it always begins with the actual character's abilities. What is the tech that's going to be in your game? And
Right.
that's pretty much going to define from beginning to end what you're
Exactly.
making your
So,
level.
like you were talking about, if we're playing a card game, that's our level design is completely different, right? It's like our level design is basically you're playing in the small area. There's your level, okay? You're then basically you go from UI, and then you go to the other extreme, like say for example BioShock, which was a master class in environmental storytelling. Um, Level design was okay, but I think the environmental storytelling and all the other aspects of it, like the world building, really took over for some of the maybe when we're talking level design, some of the boring corridors and stuff like that, which encroach into level design. But Bioshock made a really good attempt at getting all those together as best as it could.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, definitely.
And to Chris's comment, I've not heard the actual technical name, but the actual approach does sound very familiar in terms of.
Oh,
Yep, go ahead.
are we talking about 2D level design?
Creating a. So it's kind of like making like picturesque. So instead of that,
Oh,
trying to.
okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So one of the things is like we were talking about with the character, right? So you start with your character
Hmm.
and you say, what can my character do? What are my verbs? And then you make sure the world that he can interact with does not break any of those contracts, right? Like, for example, I think you could almost every gamer has run into this where they think you can jump to a point and you can't. And the reason is because the level design did not follow metrics, right? They might
Hmm.
have made that box just wacky. They didn't follow like a color scheme. There wasn't rules that adhere to you that say if you can reach a place, you can reach this place. Look at the new God of War, for example, or like Uncharted, right? They use scratch marks or they use yellow and stuff like that to do that. But anyway, back to the original point. You
Hmm.
start with your character, and then from your character, how much space is that character gonna be able to take up, and what can he do? And so then you can start constructing your like basics from there. Um, Also, Chris brought up the point about picturesque, and that's another aspect, right, of creating memorable level design. Is like literally like when you start a level framing. So you want to frame where you want the player to go. You want to encourage them. You want to encourage curiosity, desire to do something, right? And so like if I just put you in somewhere and you have no desire to go to do it, you're just like, what do I do? Well, that's really poor level design, really poor environmental design. Environmental art might be good, but if I don't know what I need to do and it hasn't been, then of course that's a failure also in level design because you can literally lead a whole game with no words, just with a level, right? It's a level design. And so the way you construct that has to encompass all holistic aspects of it, right? So we have to consider the framing, the focus, the planning, the character, and then what's the our intent as the level developer? What do we want the player to feel, right? So
Hmm.
like I can go and I can play with space. If I want the player to feel scared, I can kind of scrunch down the area and he's in a smaller combat space and there's not a lot of spaces to go, right? And you can feel like that, or you can go overboard and it's just too much and it's frustrating, so you have to meet a middle ground. And then you
Hmm.
can like after the conflict you can let the player out into a larger area, and so that gives you an emotional response also of like exiting. You just had this intense battle and you exit out and birds are chirping and then the Last of
Hmm.
Us 2 giraffe comes by, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
So
Yep, and going back to a point you said a minute ago about like setting up a level where you think you can make that jump but you can't. That's another reason why when you're building a level, you need to have your core gameplay loop pretty much firm at that point.
yeah, for sure, for sure. You might have like a little bit of time. I mean, I might if you were working with me and you're like, yeah, I haven't got my metrics right. I don't know how high the jumps or the
Hmm.
loops are going to be. I'm going to be like, well, I'm gonna like figure it out like in a week because that's how we're going to build the game. You have to know.
Yep.
It's called your metrics, right? So you know your player can jump 3 meters high or
Hmm.
whatever, or four, and if he's running, he can jump 4 meters high. And so that's how you build everything together. And if something breaks that contract, that creates frustration. That tells the player that you didn't consider them at all. Your quality control probably wasn't good. It sets a lot of red flags, right? And for me, that's one of the most frustrating things. If I can't reach a ledge, dude, like I'm like, yeah, I'm getting
Hmm.
mad.
Yeah, and there were a lot of NES games, especially everyone's favorite, the LGN games, that they would typically, like, if this is the gap that you have to jump, they'll make your actual jump distance maybe like this. So you have to be almost like pixel precise
Perfect.
leaping
Yeah,
off that edge, or you're going to fall every time. And
exactly.
this is again why you need to get your metrics and your core gameplay loop set, because it really is going to determine what kind of game you're making. If you are making, a very relaxed platformer, let's say a Braid, or even like an older Mario game, you know,
Yeah.
you can have your jumps be very forgiving. If you want to make a Celeste, a Super Meat Boy, um, Spelunky, and so on, then you can set things up, very difficult. But if you can't get that down in terms of what the player can do, and this is also why you have to be really careful if you have to redesign any of your moves and abilities. So we've seen some games where they may add in
Yeah.
a new tech, like let's say halfway through development, and then they didn't really do any play testing, and then you realize that tech just breaks every level.
Everything. Everything in the game is completely broken. Yeah. I feel you.
Mm. And to Chris's going back to Chris's point about again like that framing or that picturesque nature of level design, that is something that again it really kind of speaks at the heart of how level designing has really evolved over the past 30 years. Especially if we look at like first person shooter or action based games. That a lot of the older games were very maze like in their approach. They would use, the same textures for every single wall. Like every corridor looked exactly like every other corridor.
Hmm.
And while that certainly added to the challenge, it meant that these levels had very little personality in that respect. And then we kind of got into the quote unquote modern day FPS shooter, the Call of Duties, where now levels are just very much very long corridors.
Right.
So that
Right.
cut down on the complexity, but also cut down on the depth.
Right.
And now we're kind of in this like in between. Like Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal were probably like some like return to forms in terms of
Definitely.
FPS design.
Definitely. And offering some verticality because you need some verticality in your FPSs and stuff like that. And it's definitely a return to form because a lot of those that era, like the Brown Call of Duty era, that shooters were really stodgy. And like
Mm-hmm.
unless you were playing like maybe multiplayer and like the multiplayers maps were designed and they were fun. But if you were playing just a campaign in that, like it's just a you're going straight through a corridor, you go into a room, shoot some guys,
Mm-hmm.
cutscene, and it was nothing much to it, right? And of course, you can do massive Michael
Mm-hmm.
Bay explosions and stuff like that, but it's easy to see through that. It's just you have a high production value and not much in planning or like even considering what this player's movement abilities are and stuff like that. Not no knock on it, but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely.
Yep, and it is very tricky in terms of trying to get these levels to basically your design levels both in terms of the level design, but you also need to give it that sense of personality.
Right.
And there are a lot of action-based games that again like it just feels like you're going from one square room to the next square room to the next square room. And when we talk about memorable levels, you have to consider again both environmental and the level, like the actual obstacle design, because the obstacles in your game, be it enemies, turrets, saws, whatever, they're a part of the game
Of
design as
the
well.
game. They're a part of the level design, right? So okay, so your torrent, for example, it's like, what's the range on the torrent, right? How far can it shoot you? Can
Mhm.
it move? And so like and every enemy, like how much does it take it down? So you can have different enemy variants inside of a room, and that itself creates its own level design, right? Like so you have
Mhm.
is it
Yeah.
asymmetrical enemy design? And so you'll have one a certain way, and because of that you have to have a plan. You'll have like a
Mhm.
caster, and then you'll have a melee, right? So how do you deal with that? And so
Mhm.
that itself is just another way of designing the level, and that can help, especially if you're going the room by room route.
Mhm.
That might help spice some things up.
Yeah.
Do some maybe try some environmental storytelling or something like that on top of that. That might be helpful if you're
Yeah.
doing that.
And like details like that are very important. We're talking about more non-linear design. So this is something that really came into forefront with 3D level design, when suddenly you could actually render an entire city or entire hospital or town in Silent Hill, and you need to give that sense of landmarks. Because if your levels or if your environment doesn't have personality, if it's all just literally, a gray street,
Yeah.
it's very hard to create that mental map.
Hmm.
There was this game that I played, Siren. I don't know if anyone played this one from the PlayStation. I think it was PlayStation 2 or PlayStation 3 era. This was a horror game.
Two or three. Yeah. Hmm.
And what the game did was it gave you a map, it gave you landmarks on the map, it didn't tell you where you were. And your only way to navigate was basically by all the landmarks. So if you're near, giant broken statue, and you look on the map and it's like, here's giant broken statue, and let's say there's destroyed building over here, you're going to have to kind of, angle yourself to the west. And it is very hard to make levels that well. I know if for anyone who's played any of Valve's games, they oftentimes have their developer or director's commentary tracks, especially in Half-Life 2. And they talk about that challenge of they're building the environment to guide the player.
Right.
And I know people have been, copying those notes that Valve laid out for years, and for good reason. It's an idea that if you want the player to go somewhere, have a light, have something in the environment that kind of tracks your eye to it. When we
Right.
play a lot of open world games, there's that idea of having those points of interest. I mean, who here hasn't played an Assassin's Creed or an Elder Scrolls game where you're just standing on a mountain or a high place,
And you're
and
like, I
you,
want to go there.
you go there and there and there, and you just pick a direction and run? And
Yeah.
that's how you kind of like create that, create your own gameplay when you play those games.
Yeah, and you can like create your endless gameplay loop of just like discovering things, right? You go to one place and that gives you a
Hmm.
new vantage point to see something else. But if we're going to like a more linear design, like say, let's take like BioShock for example,
Hmm.
Mike, and you walk into an area and then you have your environmental storytelling, right? You can say, okay, well, we're underwater. There's
Hmm.
uh, dead corpses everywhere. What's going on? There was a party that's happened.
Hmm.
What's going on? And then immediately I think like it's a splicer pretty quick, and you start realizing stuff's pretty dark.
Hmm.
And so like you can go, that route, but you still, underneath it all, you still have to have a level that's fun and a reason to progress. So like for example in
Hmm.
BioShock, you could say you're using the environmental storytelling to push you forward in the level. In an open world like Breath of the Wild, for example, I see something way far off there. I'm like, what is that castle? I gotta go there. What is happening? And then you'll just do whatever, and so that'll take up your whole gameplay play loop to literally get to that long point. And then, or maybe, for example, what's another game that has another framing? Maybe you got one off the top of your head
Off of what in terms of
for
framing?
framing, like when you're entering a level and then you immediately know
Oh,
your
when you
destination.
see.
You see your landmark.
Oh,
um
the 3D Mario games have gotten quite good at that in terms of you open up a level and you see, a giant castle, you see,
right.
a town in the distance. In Super Mario Odyssey, they had like the giant floating
Odyssey.
pyramid.
Mhm.
And it's that sense that, yes, you have all the space, but you can focus your attention here
Right.
and there and there.
Mhm.
And I'm glad that you mentioned open world because that's going to be my next point. Because open world is, I think, oftentimes I see it as kind of a design trap for a lot of indie developers and even first timers in terms of trying to create a sense of space that works.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is that I play a lot of these open style games, and you give me, a tri state area to explore, and there's
Nothing.
nothing in there. There's maybe
Right.
just one thing in this entire sea of just assets.
Mhm.
And the problem is that if you're trying to give that player the sense of a direction, you have to design this space to make it want to be explorable. And that doesn't mean, of course, you should put collectible coins or the feathers from Assassin's Creed 2 all over the place. But if you're going to make this space, you have to fill it with something. And a lot of indie games, and especially I think those that are more story driven, will typically don't. That is
No.
just you exploring, it takes you 50 minutes to walk around, and there's only just the main story beat on this entire map. And
Like
yeah,
I think when it comes to indie game devs like that, like I think they're more like excited that they put that little tri-state area together for to explore, and they're like, you should be happy exploring my tri-state area.
yep,
And it's like, no, not really. I don't know if you remember like back in like PS1 days or old PC games, and like when you can actually like first enter like a little room or something, and
mm-hmm,
you would walk in and you would explore, and you would be able to enter something, and then the disappointment when you would walk up to something and you couldn't interact with it, and you would traverse this long PS1 area to find out you couldn't do it. It was just a texture. And so like,
mm-hmm,
don't do that. Don't do that.
yeah,
Don't make your landmass a texture.
yeah, and if you don't have like interesting things or you don't
Things.
have things in your level to do, there's no shame in just, restricting or cutting that level down. It's
Right,
better to
right,
be
right.
focused than it is just to say, here's just this massive space, just, you know, there's stuff.
Yeah, and like you could take so much stuff, and I think we were talking about this yesterday, like respecting the player's time,
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh and respecting like you condense everything down in this game, like whatever game you were referencing, that one storyline and that beat, you condense it down into a really small like
Mm-hmm.
town area, and you could have a lot happening, and it would be more organic, like things would develop more organically. You'd be like, well, someone's here, maybe I have someone else here, and I kind of have something else going on here, and you would definitely have a much more rich and dense story in a quicker time, and no one's bored just walking around.
Yeah.
So
And yeah, and as you said, like respecting the player's time, like this is something we talked about, I think, last week in terms of consumer expectations.
mhm.
That is a very big point in the market today. People don't want to play, 80 hours of a game where 60 hours of it is just filler or just,
Right.
boring padding based stuff. You have to give the player a reason to explore. And if you don't have that reason, then don't build your levels to kind of give that illusion. Because
Right.
as you said earlier, like the idea that you see this like really weird canyon, or you see this like odd building, you get over there, you look around, there's nothing. It's just like,
Like
okay,
literally
why
nothing.
is this
Not even
here?
like a little treasure chest,
Mm-hmm.
or like not even something. It's just like, hey, the weird building was here. And so it's like you just threw that asset there and you thought nothing of it,
Mm-hmm.
or regardless. But like, yeah, like if you are designing an open world game, every little thing that you can see or that you can view, there should be some thought into it, and you should be able to say, what is a player, if they see this, what do they want to do, what desire would they get from this,
Mm-hmm.
and then what would the payoff be when they get there. If the payoff is disappointment,
Mm-hmm.
well, you're heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And to Ambient's comment about Breath of the Wild, yeah, the ability that when you give the player like very powerful movement tech like that, it becomes a lot harder to build interesting challenges. We played the game Webbed last year. This was an indie game that was all about spider web physics swinging. It was a lot of fun to play,
Wow.
but the issue was it kind of ran out of ways of testing the player. Because it's kind of like the old Superman challenge. That if you're Superman, how do you build an interesting challenge for that? If you can just fly, beat everything up in a single punch,
What do you do? Yeah.
and it's tough. You have to come up with more creative solutions.
Definitely, definitely, definitely. And designing, ambient melancholy was talking about designing for it.
Hmm.
You just got to keep in considerations like whatever again, everything that they have in the game that is climbable, they have to make sure they have to consider the edge cases. If you climb all the way to the top, what's at the top? There's either going to be nothing or there's going to be something, but it's just that is at the very beginning, that mechanic was in there. So the whole game was designed around that. So where the level designers were designing, they were like, okay, yeah, everything's climbable. So they know that when they're making it. If they would introduce that mechanic like
Yep.
80% through of the game, then yeah, there would be all kind of crazy horrible glitches, but that was in from the beginning. So every
Hmm.
single level designer was aware of that fact and utilized that fact. And I think most level designers would be kind of pumped if they could, if that was a feature that they were able to utilize in their game. So yeah,
Yep.
that's how you design for it.
Yep.
Just planning.
Yep. And again, being able to have, oh yeah, the Korok seeds.
Cork seeds.
Yeah. And again, understanding what is going to be the extent of your movement tech
Mhm.
is a very challenging aspect. And like sticking with Nintendo, one of the things that they've done really well that I really haven't seen any other developer really get to that same level is designing levels around multiple skill levels or skill curves. And what I mean by that is that the levels are always set. And again, like this goes back to Chris's point about like design levels, very unique, very specific. Is that you can approach a level in a Mario game, or I'm sorry, specifically 3D Mario, in like 3 to 4 different ways based on your own mastery. And the game rewards you by either giving you shortcuts, finding additional coins or stars, and you have these different paths and routes that they feel very much organic. Like you think that you're kind of getting one over Nintendo, but I'm pretty sure they considered, how what is the actual maximum distance you can do if you do a triple jump into a wall jump into a cappy throw into a cappy bounce into a dive into another cappy. And I mean, you see like speedrunners. Like if you've watched anyone speedrun a 3D Mario game,
It's wild.
like
Yeah.
they get some crazy tech happening.
I
And
can barely do like one hat flip. These
yeah,
guys are just
yeah.
wild.
And again, like the beauty about Nintendo's level design is that it's set up to accommodate this. And this
Yep.
is the thing that always hurts, or when I play like indie platformers, especially indie 3D platformers, they're always very linear. That there's only one kind of jump, there's only one route. There's no real setup to let the player, excuse me, explore the space and their own tech.
Mhm.
I played a.
It feels like you're playing like in Resident Evil 1
Mhm.
platformer style. Like if you go from like Super Mario, right? And
Mhm.
then you're playing an indie 3D platformer, you're very stilted and they don't, jump, maybe jump and very few in a flip, maybe, right? Like
Yeah.
very few options and movements and verbs. And one of the reasons is that is because I would have to say if it's a small team and
Yeah.
if they're thinking what they're doing and they try not to offer all those verbs, then it would just break everything like we were talking about. Like
Mhm.
if they're say, okay, well let's climb everything, they would need like a lot more QA testing and level designers for that. So that's probably
Mhm.
one of the reasons why it happens, but I'm sure you could pull it off if you plan well enough for it.
Yeah. And again, it's really advanced design when we're talking about making levels in this scope. And again, it's why getting that core gameplay loop down is such an important aspect. Now, there's another point that I wanted to go back to that we were talking about Doom and specifically arena design or combat design.
Mhm.
And what you said about having the enemies become a form of the level design itself, that is definitely its own, unique aspect when we talk about memorable levels, especially again in games that are combat focused. Like we go
Yes.
back to the Souls games, there is a fundamental difference in how a level can be paced if you have, just a normal, grunt over here, or if you have one of those black knights guarding a
Mhm.
door.
Mhm.
And we've seen, speaking about the Souls games, we've seen them use enemies as a form of gating as well. That instead of you having to level up, they'll just say, hey, you want to go this way? Well, here's a giant black knight with his halberd who can one shot you. You could
He
try
has
and fight
he
him.
has red eyes. His eyes are
Oh,
red,
yes.
by the way.
Hmm. Oh, yes, especially from Demon Souls. You could go this way, but maybe you want to come back when you've got a little bit better armor. Or the dragon in the Demon Souls guarding all that lovely treasure in the first area. It's like,
Yes.
yeah, you can run down there if you want, but he's lifting his head up and something's about to come your way.
He's gonna get you crispy.
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And that's like especially for combat games, like
Hmm.
space and enemy design are really important, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the area you're fighting in, if you want to have verticality, if the AI can have verticality or not, if you can have verticality. And so that's really, really super important. So you can have, again, we were talking about, you can have ranged, melee, and then you can have multiples of that. And then just really spice things up. You put three different ones in an area and you can really like, you can have some really interesting combat designs.
Yeah.
Maybe if you put some cover in there or different things, but that can just create just like, or for example, we're talking about Smo in Dark Souls,
Mm-hmm.
Smo and Oreo and Smo's, like that boss design, and it's just two. It's just a boss. It's a boss design, but like they're almost like a level,
Mm-hmm.
like the way they're designed, and it's a massive challenge for those things because they're two disparate different enemy designs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep, and you can do that. Like some of the one of my early posts I wrote about Dark Souls specifically was how they really elevated boss designs in their games, and specifically that was because the bosses kind of melded with the environments. The
right,
man eater gargoyles in Demon Souls, like playing it on a square flat surface, yeah, okay, they're not that bad. Find them on a giant bridge that's only like this wide, and they can just tail swipe you off at any time.
exactly.
It's another story.
Exactly. So depending on where you meet that boss and or the enemy and the design of the level just drastically can change everything. So
Mm-hmm. All right, Chris. Have a good night. Get those
thank you,
shoes
Chris.
as
Thanks
well.
for stopping by, my man.
Yep, and you have to to your point about like how the enemies behave and how that must factor into level design. That's something you have to be really careful of. Because if your game, let's say, is a cover-based shooter, and every enemy is a sniper, and there's just one little patch of cover in one spot, how is the player going to react to that? There's the infamous Sniper Town, and I think this was the original Medal of Honor. That was just like a giant mess of textures with snipers, that are the same color as the building
Oh
sniping at
boy.
you.
Oh
And it's just
boy.
like, really? Um,
You got like one little pixel to see him. Oh
yeah.
no, that sounds terrible.
And I was playing the game of Power Slave, the remake of that on stream, and they have these enemies that have tracking shots, and to really like stick that knife into you, the first level they're introduced is nothing but these like wide open areas where there's no cover. So those shots can like track you from like 60 feet away, and it's like, okay, what am I supposed to do to get around it? And again, you have to be very mindful of not only your abilities but what the enemy can do. Like if you have an enemy that let's say can oh, here's one from Doom Eternal. If you have an enemy who can revive, like the Archvile, and all of a sudden he can just revive every enemy around him, and
Yeah.
you build a space that's entirely enclosed and you can't see around walls, well, that is going to be incredibly difficult for someone to find him and kill him before all heck breaks
Right.
loose.
Right. And that'll be a very claustrophobic, frustrating fight, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yep, and to Chris's comment, exactly, and that's the major point about environmental design.
Mhm.
That if you're going to build a sense of space, each space should look distinctive. And I use the word distinctive here because I think there's a tendency when we talk about this to say realistic. But like we all know what Annalundo really looks like. We have the exact map of that, or Playtown. What we mean is that each area should look like it fits. Again, like going
Right.
back to what you said with environmental design.
It doesn't have to be realistic, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing, it in your head, it has to make sense though, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it has to fit the thing. So like if we're in an office building, it doesn't you're not looking around or are there exactly like this far from the exit door and is
Mm-hmm.
are there fire extinguishers? You're not going that, but if you see a fire extinguisher and you see a few doors and it seems like it makes sense and the space isn't too small, and then that portrays what the area is, all that has to make sense and all that has to fit. And
Mm-hmm.
as far as making something memorable, like that can you can really do that well with environmental design, right, and
Mm-hmm.
storytelling. and you can just put a few things on a wall, maybe a poster, just little things here and there, little assets that tell the story, and you can help differentiate. Even if you're not doing a lot,
Hmm.
you can do a little bit, and the little bit can go a long way. So it's
Hmm.
going to go a lot longer than just having a room with nothing in it, and every room's the same. So
Yeah, and that's also again important in terms of the player figuring out their own mental map of the place, that they can understand. Okay, the green room with the yellow plan leads me to the save area, while the red room with blue doors is where there's a treasure that I have to come back to. And
right,
like,
and then
yeah.
also you mentioned the colors. Sorry, but you're mentioning the colors. So if you use colors in your game and you stick to a rule, like green means safe, red means danger, yellow
Hmm.
means ledge, and if you keep all of those the same, right, then the player will know. And then so if they see a lighting, maybe blue lighting means this is an area to
Hmm.
explore, and you can use those. And if you keep them similar, it will help the player understand the level a little more. So
Yeah,
sorry, continue.
as a very subtle example of that, in the Left 4 Dead games, what they did was whenever you're near a safe room, they'll have like a spray paint of like the little safe room logo on a
Hmm.
wall or a
Hmm.
sign. And that's a very simple way of having that environmental storytelling, but also guiding the player to say, okay, you're close. And as you said, lighting is a very effective example. What you don't want to do, and again, this is another trap I think some developers fall into, is break your own rules. If you condition the player to say every green light means a save room, and then halfway through, let's say now you walk into a green light room and it's a trap and the guy one shots you, the player's going to feel very annoyed about that.
Probably gonna quit too,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
that. Definitely.
Yeah, and yeah, to Chris's comment, yeah, and that definitely leads, or those questions definitely build into environmental storytelling, especially lore,
Mm.
in a lot of these games, and it's something I think a lot of developers don't necessarily think about, but it's often those extra little flourishes that can really make a game stand out above and beyond everything else in the space.
It's really like the small things. I think in my YouTube feed just the other day, I saw something pop up, and it said like game of the year. This is why this is the game of the year, and it was like from Assassin's Creed, and it was like
Hmm.
I don't remember which one, but you just walk up to the penguins, and the penguins jumped off into the water, right? And that was it. It was just that the
Hmm.
designer decided to put penguins in the game, and they would jump into the water, and they thought that interaction was amazing. So again, little things like that make a big difference. If you went up to the penguins and you started bumping into them and they didn't do nothing, then you'd be
Hmm.
disappointed, right? And you'd be like, well, they're just, are they, what is this? But if they actually did something and there's a slight playoff, that goes a really long way. So
Yeah,
like whatever you're trying to do, small little playoffs can go a long way, and tell the player that you really care
yeah.
about them and their time.
Like probably like the most cutest example of that is the "Can you pet the dog" meme.
Can you pet the dog?
Yep.
Exactly. Mhm. Yeah, and then people will literally like just put that in their game and say, yeah, and they'll tweet at pet the dog, and
Hmm.
for that as an advertisement to do that, because you have to pet the dog in the game.
Hmm. Yeah. And that I'm glad Chris brought that up, because that was another point that I wanted to touch on, and that is when we're talking about procedural design. Because if we're talking about memorable levels or very, picturesque levels, procedural design is oftentimes a complete antithesis of this. And something I wrote about in my roguelike book, it's something that anyone who's designed roguelikes will tell you. It is very hard to create an algorithm that can create levels with personality. And you can tell when a developer struggles when you'll have like a building that's like, okay, this building has the staircase and the bathroom that leads into the basement. The basement has doors upside down. There's a kitchen table in the bedroom. There's a shower in a plant, and all the doors are upside down, and it makes no sense. And while that can certainly give you the MC Escher experience, it's unfortunately, if you're trying to create a level that both is interesting and challenges the player, it just doesn't work. And unfortunately, I play games like that where the procedural generation will give me like a level that I can't get through. It's like, okay, all you have to do is do a quadruple jump into a dash here, but there's no power like that, so the level just doesn't work.
Right, you're right. Right. Procedural generation, like, is I think it should have a small place, but I don't think it should be used like entirely for game design. So if you're going to use it, you still need, otherwise you're just gonna it's gonna be too sterile and things
Hmm.
will break. And in my cases, like, I mean, something like Spelunky, for example, I guess it doesn't have to be because the gameplay loop is fun and satisfying. It doesn't really need to be that memorable. I mean, because it's just a
Hmm.
gameplay loop, right? That you're kind of going through. But if
Hmm.
if you're relying on procedural generation, you're going to end up like with a really sterile environment, and it's hard to get memorable things across. Or how are you going to do like environment storytelling, or how are you going to do um, just interesting cinematic movements with a procedurally generated like levels or anything like that.
Yeah.
That's the hard part about procedural generation. So
The trick that I've seen a lot of developers do to kind of counter that is that they will design a linear room or a linear section that can then be placed inside a level. So, like, this is where you do your cinematic cutscene, and this is
gotcha.
where the linear boss fight is.
Mhm.
But oftentimes, like, when it doesn't feel right, it again has that feeling of your level is just a series of these chunks of environments. Okay, here's the arena fight chunk. Here's a store. Here's the exit. And there's no real connective tissue between them. And
Right. No reason. It's just like
mhm,
you set the rules for it to have the things, but what is it there for and why do they connect? Like you said, no connective tissue at all.
yeah.
So,
All right, Chris, thanks for watching and have a great night. Part two.
all right. See,
Yeah, and
I,
like, did you play Dead Cells, by the way?
I did not. I did not play.
No.
I've watched much footage of it though.
Yeah, like for me, I just did a dissecting design on Dead Cells, and I felt like it's a really great action game, but I just did not like the roguelike elements of it. Like again, it felt like the movement tech was just not like the general movement and motion was not really being factored in the levels. Like the levels just still felt very samey, no matter what I did, and that again is that issue when you have procedural generation. You can't do Super Meat Boy or Celeste challenges with a procedural engine. Like, there's no way you're gonna get that level of fidelity and challenge. So you have to come with something else. But oftentimes, if you're going to, and again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier, if you're giving the player all kinds of crazy abilities and movement tech, the levels need to respond to that. Because if not, then at best, it's going to be boring. At worst, you just break your entire level scheme.
Break the game. Yeah, yeah. The game makes no sense, no
Hmm.
reason. Um, Definitely. Um,
I'm thinking, I can't think of exact names all the time, but I've played like 2D platformers from like smaller indie developers where, they'll say, okay, here's a super difficult section, but then I realize, well, what if I just, wall jump up there, walk over, I just skip the entire area entirely. And it's that case where you can tell when the developer actively put something or actually consider that, and when they did not really have an idea. And I think like if we look at the scope of Mario Maker, like we have seen so much creativity and just all across the spectrum in terms of
yeah.
quality and challenge from that space.
Mhm. I mean, I've seen levels I never even thought would be possible, right? Like in a
Hmm.
Mario game, people pulling off challenges, all kind of doing wild speed runs and stuff. It's really neat.
Hmm.
But yeah, that.
And I mean, even like the Kaizo community has been developing some insane levels out of Super Mario
Yeah, I
World.
love watching that. I love watching the Kaizos every now and then. I'm from drinking a coffee, I'll watch a speed run of it, and it's mind blowing what they're doing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that actually takes me to another point. And as a time check, we're about like 40 minutes in, so we still got plenty of time. And you guys have any questions for us in chat, feel free to pose it to us. But when you are kind of designing, I guess, like the mechanics of what your character can do, it becomes very important to understand again what can you throw in the level to actually make use of this. And when I wrote about in the Game Design Deep Dive Platformers, I said that some basic general rules in terms of levels that a level should only be as long as you can keep giving the player something new to do. And specifically, it has to all be kept within, I think, like a same general template. As in, you don't want to design a level that is, this level is a fire world, ice world, spikes, buzzsaw, space section. Design,
That's
a
that's
fire
an
level.
old way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Go ahead.
You you kind of want each level to have that sense of personality to it. I think the Kaiser community has really gotten good at this, especially in the last like 3 to 4 years, as it really blew up more, I guess, quote unquote, mainstream in terms of design their levels around, these very highly specific technical challenges. And then, like, you'll do this section, and then the next section is like another variation of it. Like, it lasts, I think, long enough to get its message, but it doesn't overstay its welcome.
Right, and like Nintendo's really good about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Like they'll introduce a mechanic, right, and a brand new mechanic, and they'll show you that, and it might be the only time that you use that mechanic in the whole game. But they'll introduce you it, and then you'll do it in that level and get better at it, and then that's it, and then they won't use it again. Maybe later they'll bring it out, but yeah, they'll introduce the mechanic, make
Mm-hmm.
you get real good at it, and then that's it. So
Yep, and you also, I think, as a developer, need to be, I think, very economically minded in terms of what you build in these levels. Like, it's if you want to do one-off levels, nothing is stopping you, but you'll get more value if you create, let's say, an enemy that can show up in multiple levels, or let's say you have an enemy that can show up in any level in World 3. And, like, again, like, we keep going back to Nintendo, but they are one of the best when it comes to level design like this. Like, if you look at Super Mario Brothers 3, every world has a distinct theme, and that theme can be felt in every stage. And I mean, as a kid, like, how many people were wowed the first time they went to like the giant world, and that was World 4, and all of a sudden you have like
yeah,
Goombas like this big, and like the pipes are gigantic.
pipes and the boots. Yeah, it was
Mm-hmm.
amazing. Still, I still it gives me chills, man.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
awesome. Dang.
And again, it's just about figuring out what is the goal of your level. And again, like when we're talking about this is definitely more like 100% level design. Like we're not really thinking about environmental right now. We're thinking about, okay, what is the test of this place? Is it going to be using a flutter jump? Is it wall jumping, dodging lasers? In Super Meat Boy, those horrible missiles that would track you like nobody's business.
Wow, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Those were fun. Those were fun. But yeah, definitely like you can use each level to test the player, teach them a new mechanic, and then go along with it. And going back to the point about new developers trying to do one off, one of the things, just a side note, like if you're working on a game and you're coding anything, you need to keep in mind whatever you're working on to maybe be able to use the code later on. So if you're learning something, if you're trying to learn a mechanic, a design mechanic, see how it can benefit you further down in your other games, and also how it can reverberate and be used more often in your game, because you can't keep reinventing the wheel
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over again for every little thing. Otherwise, you're going to end up in that 8 year, 10 year game development cycle. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
and that was kind of the downfall of a Duke Nukem Forever. That as stories
yeah.
went, like the creator just basically said, like every new game he played was like, "Ooh, this is cool. Let's put it in
Let's
our
add
game."
that. Let's put it in this one. Let's add that. Let's add that. And then all of a sudden you scope creep yourself into it's just not going to work. And none of those, and then you have 1,000 mechanics and none of them work together because none of them were designed with working in mind or being cohesive in any way. So you just have this massive disjointed mess of a fantasy game kind of thing.
Yeah,
So yeah, poor Duke
yeah.
Nukem.
And again, the more mechanics, the more verbs you throw into your game, the more your game has to accommodate that. So, yeah.
Deus Ex is one that kind of always is it a man Deus Ex Mankind?
Deus Ex.
Deus
Deus,
Ex,
yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that one always kind of surprises me because that one has so many mechanics and like different ways to approach it. So
Mm-hmm.
that one's always kind of amazed me in their ability to do that. Like
Mm-hmm.
you can conquer a situation in many different ways, like depending on how you level or how you
Mm-hmm.
do things. So that one's is really cool with that.
Yeah, and that would take us into talking about immersive sims, and that is definitely its own topic for sure.
For sure. Let's not
Mm-hmm.
touch that right
Yeah,
now.
and again, like as you're building mechanics out, and like going back again, like in terms of being economical with them, it's better to come up with abilities for the player to use that can be applied anywhere in your game. Because if you don't consider that, again, you're going to have those level issues that, if you give the player the ability to wall jump and you don't properly mind like where you're setting things up, player can either skip a level or the level just may not even work because the player just knows exactly how to get around it. Now, again, like some games, like Celeste is a good example of this. Celeste has a lot of advanced movement tech in that game that, in kind of a very subtle way, you can use this movement tech throughout the entirety of Celeste, but they will save those messages for when you get to like the B side challenges or the C side, and where it now becomes required. And like the people who have speed ran Celeste, like you'll see them, they'll skip entire rooms because they know how to use the advanced tech. And like again, like this is not a case of the developer not understanding it. They did that on purpose. They said, "Okay, we'll let you do this, but we're not actually going to explain it to you until the time is right." So then it's up to you.
Exactly.
And I'm sure out there somebody probably tested the tech out and figured it out long before the tutorial message came up. But it's always that idea, and I think this kind of gets at heart of a lot of good level design that the developer is designing a space for the player to kind of explore on their own. Like you want to guide the player, but you don't want to guide the player. If that makes any
Exactly.
sense.
Exactly. Yeah, a player does not want to be you don't want to be told, you want to explore. So you want to encourage curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
You have to give the player a desire to do something. And you can't say, I mean, my like if there's a tutorial and the tutorial's like go here, press A, like that's not fun. And if your game is literally like almost a tutorial in a way, that's not fun either, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
the you're just literally following a path you don't know, it's you're just on a theme park ride, and I guess that's cool if you want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But most players do want to enjoy and express themselves, right, through the verbs and the actions and the characters and the level and the story and the world that you provided for them. And
Mm-hmm.
apparently, you should have planned and decided everything cohesively, holistically together for them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, players don't like that at all.
Yeah. And I guess as another very important point, again, we're focusing on reflex-based games. If you're making a good level, there has to be that sense of flow. And this is something that you mentioned, I think, earlier in the discussion about, if you're going to have a brutally difficult section, maybe you'll have like a little cool down, wind down part after that. You don't want
Right.
a level to just be, ratchet up to 11 for 40 minutes of gameplay. One, that's incredibly hard to maintain, and two, you're going to exhaust, I think, a lot of players before they get to the end.
Yeah, I mean, like you cannot. You have to have ebb and flows, right? So you have to have periods of conflict,
Mm-hmm.
periods of relief, chill time. Players need chill time, right? They just need to kind of chill out and look around
Mm-hmm.
and maybe take a breath. But if the whole time they are having a cardiac arrest because they're freaking out for 40 minutes, that they're not. It's not a fun situation. There might be a few players that enjoy that, but
Mm-hmm.
that's a very small niche, right?
Yep.
And you're not shooting for a small niche if you're developing.
Yeah. And speaking about difficulty, that I think again is another thing you have to consider with your game as much as the core gameplay loop. That how high do you want to make your difficulty curve go, or how high does a skill curve need to be to play your game? And you have to be very mindful of this. A friend of mine, Patrick Holman, I think that's the name. Hopefully I didn't butcher. He wrote the reverse engineer, reverse design series where he breaks down like beginning to end various games, and he talked about Super Mario World. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that when you look at what Nintendo did, they didn't just keep ratcheting up the difficulty from, World 1 is, 2 out of 10, World 2 is 3 out of 10, and like World 8 is, 15 out of 10. They didn't do that. Instead, they would introduce different mechanics and tech and then rearrange them in ways to give
Yes.
it the illusion of a new challenge. So if, let's
Right.
say, the first time you run into a bullet bill, it's just like straight grass, he shoots a bullet, you jump over it. Later on, maybe you're bouncing on note blocks and bullet bills are careening around your head. So it's not necessarily, again, just saying we're going to just keep upping and upping the difficulty. It's just figuring out new ways of repurposing, again, all your mechanics to give that sense that there is a sense of difference in your levels.
Right. And so you're saying 2 points about the end of level when there's nothing new for the player to discover. And then the other thing what we were talking
Mm-hmm.
about earlier with the enemies is so like you're talking about the bullet bill and then the blocks, right? And the same thing you can do that with enemies. So you could put two different enemies or three
Mm-hmm.
different enemies, and that combination is a completely different story, right? So three different
Mm-hmm.
enemies in a small area or a different area, completely different situation. And so that definitely can add a lot of variety and keep things from being stale. So right, so it's not like we added a whole new there's new enemies. It's the same enemies, but this just the arrangement of them or where you meet them and how you meet them, or and where you fight them can just totally make a whole new experience. So
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that is definitely, I think, on the display when we talk about Doom again and Doom Eternal.
Doom.
That what they did with the Ancient Gods DLC is they really ratcheted up the difficulty simply by introducing more enemies and more higher class enemies in the same room. Like you would think that okay, you fought a was it a cyber demon in Doom Eternal? I forget the name of the giant guy in that one, but whoever that giant demon was, that okay, you fight one of them, you fight two of them. Okay, yeah, you get used to that. Okay, now fight two of them, an archvile and a marauder at the same time,
Exactly.
and suddenly this room is a lot more evil to get through.
Mhm. Right, right, definitely, and that's like definitely a good thing that indie developers should use, right? So when
Hmm.
uh, instead of trying to create one-off new situations all the time, a memorable situation could just be that one time that you fought the cyber demon and the Kako demon together, and the combo together is makes it just an extremely memorable situation for you.
Hmm.
So,
And again, it goes back to what these enemies can do and how it relates to the levels.
mhm.
And you have to, again, I think, be very careful about how much you expect out of the player. And this is, again, very important going back to the core gameplay loop and the general tone of your game. Because we've seen developers who they'll make the game look super cute, super childlike, and now we're doing quadruple wall jumps into dashes and reverse jumping to try and get through a section. And it's okay to have, you know, the expert path and like the novice path, but you again, that's more design on your point. And if you're trying to make your game more mainstream, you need to consider again who your actual audience is going to be for these kinds of challenges.
Exactly, exactly. So you got to decide. And when we're talking about the difficulty, um, you can offer different paths, right? Or you can actually just offer scaling difficulty, and
Hmm.
but giving the player different avenues to traverse an area. You can, like we were talking about, you want to go see this area. There's a black knight with red eyes blocking you, and you can go that way, and that's a way of gating. Or blocking out a special level in Celeste, maybe you got to know that triple crazy jump to get to that chest or get to the strawberry. Is it strawberries
Yeah,
or cherries? Um,
strawberries.
and so that's another way of doing it like that.
Hmm. And optional challenges are always a great way to experiment or do something extra in your game. And
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. You can add that an optional challenge, an optional environment is definitely a way to like kind of like work on your developmental skills, do something. It's kind of low stakes because it's just an optional challenge. It's not a main part of the game. People were like, ah, that was kind of annoying. That's fine. It was optional. They didn't have to do it. But if you want to slam a mechanic that you're not sure about as their main mechanic, you know what I mean. But it's a good way to test it and see how, when you're developing it, see if people like that optional room or something like that.
hmm And I think for a lot of action-based games, knowing when to end is always a very tricky point in terms of level design. Because you can just keep extending and extending and extending these sections out, but you should always aim for like a general structure. Like if your levels are normally, let's say, 4 to 6 minutes long, you shouldn't
Keep it.
break that. Like, you shouldn't say, okay, the normal level is 4 to 6 minutes long, but our final level is going to be 20 to 30 minutes long. And,
Right, because what happens is like, okay, every level's four, right? Just
mm-hmm,
4 minutes, 4 minutes, 4 minutes, and then all of a sudden you're at a level and it's like 8, 9 minutes. You're not thinking this level's really long. You're thinking I'm doing something wrong here, or
mm-hmm,
I'm going the wrong way, or this isn't right. Like you're not. You're gonna be more worried about your progression than thinking that the level is a long level, unless you read a wiki and somebody told you that. But if
mm-hmm,
you're doing that and you're breaking the rule, you just can't break the rules in that
mm-hmm.
regard, like you said.
Yeah. And again, like if you want to do something clever for a one-off, like have a boss fight that could be an auto scroller, and let's say that auto scroller is like a 6 minute long challenge,
Mhm.
you can do that as a one-off. But you need to explain, you need to give the player the idea that okay, this is different. You don't want just want to like change your rules up and then let the player kind of have to guess around. So, okay, instead of green means go, for this level, green is death now. And there's no
Yeah.
indication why or how.
Right, right, right. Exactly. Yeah. So again, keeping all of your rules, like keeping the contract to the player, always keeping that and never breaking it. So that way the player knows what they're doing, what they can do. Because when the player doesn't know what they can do or what's going on, it's not really a game anymore. It's more
hmm
like a kind of like a panic freak out if you don't know what you're doing or what to do.
Yeah, and that's, I think, another really good point. That if you're going to introduce new tech or a new rule to the player, you need to give the player the idea or have to explain to them in some way that there is a new rule. That if, let's say, like I've played a few indie games like this where I'm stuck in a section, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, and the whole point was to use a power or an ability in a way that was never used before, no idea you could even use it like this, it's going to feel like a cheat. It's
Right.
better, like, the more organic way is to create a section that the player is forced to use that power, that there's no way to get around it, and
You
in the
have to use it.
process, they get that new rule. But you don't want to just throw things in and just say, the player will figure it out.
Right. You always have to do when you're introducing a mechanic, you always want to do it low stakes,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like literally nothing and like the player has to do it to understand it. And in the player like if the player can skip it and it's like, "Hey, here's the
Ooh.
mechanic you need to learn and you can skip it." Well, that's not cool. And I've run into games like that where I'm like, "I
Mm-hmm.
don't understand this. I'm just going to skip it." And then you end up just at a game-breaking part where you needed to do that mechanic again
Mm-hmm.
in a different way that you've never used it before. So
Yeah.
again, introducing a mechanic, low stakes. And again, we go back to Nintendo. Nintendo introduces all of their mechanics first, super low stakes. Like you probably can't die, you probably can't
Mm-hmm.
lose, but you can't progress, right? So that's the main thing is like just a simple gate to teach the mechanic in a nice intuitive way that's not a tutorial, right? More
Yeah.
like it's a part of the game and you organically learn it. It's like you pick up this power and it's like, oh, new power, what do I do? I can use it on that thing over there, and then you use the power and you understand what it does.
Yeah.
So
And like organic level design is definitely a major point about making everything fit. Like as you said, like you don't want to stop the player and go, okay, this is a dash gate. You must dash through the gate. Press square to dash. You want the player to do that in one fell motion. When we talk about like again, like having these simple gates, these aren't like minute long or 10-minute long. These are maybe a second, maybe
Yeah.
2 seconds at most.
Right. Right.
Um, to give a different example, a non Nintendo example of this, Braid was really good at this. That for each world, they introduce a new time manipulation or new power. And they use the same room or the same looking room, but have a different power attached to it.
Right, right. So there's familiarity,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not you're not thrown out of your realm. You still, oh, I still know this area, and then you just have that new power and kind of change it and augment it a little bit. So that's definitely a good way. A lot of genius stuff in that game.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of a game that I think didn't work that way. If you remember Psyops, this was, I think, a PlayStation 2 game.
Yes,
And
yes.
I remember I played like 90% through the game, and then there's this one part where there are these like spike mines set up, and I think you had to use like your psychic power to like surf around them. And the game never really explained, never really gave me a time to test that. So it put me in the section where if I fail to do it, it's instant death. I have to restart the area. I just ended up getting so frustrated that I never finished the game because I got stuck at that one spot
One
and there was
spot.
no other way to get around it other than the one mechanic that I didn't know how to do all the way.
Right, and just funny. My wife plays Final Fantasy 14, and it's an MMO. And in one of the scenes, one of the quests, there's a literal stealth game. Right,
Oh
this is an
no.
MMO, and there's a stealth out of nowhere. My wife's literally never played a stealth game in her life. It doesn't really explain it, and so here she is playing a very hardcore stealth game in an MMO, and it doesn't make any sense, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's another thing. Like, don't and this is like way end game, and it's all of a sudden, hey, here's a stealth mechanic,
Yeah,
and
and
it's
I mean that describes a lot of like late '90s, mid 2000 level design. That
yeah, they
okay, you're
loved it.
playing this hardcore action game. Now it's a racing game.
Now it's a risky.
Now it's a stealth game. Now it's a beat 'em up. Now it's an RPG.
Right, right. And I think back then they were trying to sell it as like multiple modes of gameplay or
Mm-hmm.
something. They were trying things out. But yeah, that was terrible. That was a daze, man. That was fun. Like Battle Toads, you're punching and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you're surfing in the sewer.
Mm-hmm. Oh god, and the turbo tunnel as everyone's favorite section.
Turbo Tunnel, man.
And like Battletoads is one of those games that you can either describe it as one of the best design games of all time
Mhm,
or one of the worst design games of all
mhm.
time based on that rules. And yeah, and Uncharted as well. The whole era of cinematic
Yeah,
platforming as well.
yeah, yeah.
Siphon Filter. If anyone remembers
Siphon
that
filter.
series,
Mhm.
I still remember the horror of like their stealth level, where all of a sudden you can't hit anyone, or the whole place goes up and you're stuck here until you do it.
Yeah,
And
I think I quit at that point. I was like, "What? Can't
and
do this."
and again, like if you want to do something different, make it an optional, make it a bonus challenge, make it something that's not required, because you don't
Right.
want to train the player to do something that is never going to be used or referenced again.
For example, like in an open world game, you can
Hmm.
just have like little you wanna do something fun, do like a little mini game that the player
Hmm.
goes into a bar and he shoots darts or play whatever, something like that. You can do that, but it's not like all of a sudden you're fighting the last boss and now it's a CRPG, right? Like, that's not gonna happen, you know? So
Yeah, and that reminds me a lot of one of my favorite examples, The Suffering 2. This was a third person horror shooter game. And the whole game kind of trains you to use your special demon power to like kill a
that
lot
was
of
on the
enemies.
Xbox?
Xbox and PlayStation 2, I
2.
believe.
Yeah.
And then the final boss has a power that no other enemy has to knock you out of that special form. And it just completely breaks that flow. Dead Rising, they will oftentimes have a boss fight that you cannot use any of your crazy weapons or various items, and you can only use your fists. So again, if you're
Wow.
not trained, if you didn't give the player the necessary time to learn that, it just feels like you're pulling the rug out from under them.
Right, and they probably never used their fist, right, up to that point,
Yeah.
they were probably never doing melee, and they're like, "Oh, I can melee?"
Yeah.
So, you know.
If you're going, and again, like if you introduce something new, you have to give the player enough information to get around that. You don't want to just introduce newness for the sake of it. That it's just a brand new rule that just messes with you, and then it's never seen again.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I don't even know why that happened or why they started doing that. But definitely needs to not happen. We need to not do that.
Yeah, from Janšvik's song about Uncharted. Remember the final boss of Uncharted 2 caused me a lot of trouble when it's just like this
Was
like giant brute like runs around punching you, so you can't
Oh
really like.
yes, yeah, that was really weird.
Mm-hmm,
It got all supernatural right at that
mm-hmm,
part. Yeah.
yeah, it pulled a Far Cry 1. If anyone remembers the original Far Cry, it was like a military shooter, and now we
Mm-hmm.
fight mutants who can jump
Now we're
30
fighting
feet
mutants.
in the air.
I didn't understand. Like it was just regular people. We're playing Uncharted, and all of a sudden it's like ghost demon guys at the very end. And
Hmm.
yeah, that boss fight was pretty hard. I think it took me a bit to get that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, there's nothing to stop you from doing interesting things with abilities or changing rules, but you have to give the player an idea of how to get around that. God of War 2018 with the Valkyrie challenges,
Oh
like
yeah,
that can get crazy, and
yeah. Did you get him? Did you do
yeah,
him?
I did them
Mm,
all. I even did the
yeah.
Queen, and that was
Yeah, I did the Queen. The Queen took me a while. Woo, that was fun.
6 hours of pain it took me to beat that one
Hours and
fight,
hours and hours. Yeah. I don't
and
even want to know. I think it might have taken me 2 days, but I
mhm,
got it. Yeah.
yeah. And like with something like that, like with all the different rules, like, when she goes up in the air, you have to throw the shield, or when she flashes, does like the solar flare attack, you have to turn around. Like if you're going to have those things, you need to telegraph to the player that this is an option.
Hmm.
And I've seen some games where it's just like, oh, you could have just throw a rock and it distracts us. Like, wait, I can pick up rocks in this game? What? Like, and this, I think this may be a little bit off topic for memorable level design, but if you have mechanics, you have to give the player the foundational knowledge of them. Because if they don't know what they can and can't do, they're never going to be able to figure out your levels.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's like from the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from the beginning, we were talking about like you give the player abilities and they can break the level. So I think one of the things that indie games devs should do is that first solidify, get all your verbs and action that your players can do, get your metrics together, and start planning. And then from there, you can extrapolate what the player is able to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And don't change from there. And then so once you have all that, test your levels, right? Test your levels fully overpowered. If the player can level or do or gain the
Mm-hmm.
things, start the player out with everything. And so that way you can actually test it, right? And you can say, okay, well maybe I can do a new game plus on this and we can adjust things a little bit. But if you have all of the things that he can do from the start in every level, he or she, sorry, and any level, and you test that, then you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls of having an overpowered or broken game. But of course, get all of the actions and verbs that the player can do
Mm-hmm.
solidified first, and then you can build from there.
Another point that I was thinking about that I wanted to touch on, and this goes back to what we were saying about letting the player skip content or skip mechanics. You have to be very mindful as to what the player can and can't skip, or when they're able to do it. Because this is something I run into with a lot of puzzle-based games, stuff like Filament, what was it, the Talos Principle, and some of the other kind of like
Principle.
action meets puzzle designs.
Mhm.
That if you let the player skip a puzzle, but they skip learning the mechanic or
Mechanics.
rule,
Yeah,
and
I
then
that's Talos puzzle screwed me. I was like
mhm,
I missed something, and then I was like, oh, I don't understand, and then I just had to stop. You know what I mean?
yeah,
What was the other puzzle by that other good puzzle game that came out around that time by oh geez,
the swapper maybe.
mm, it was a bigger developer that did it.
Um, Are you thinking of the one from Jonathan Blow?
Jonathan Blows, yes. So Jonathan Blows. Did you play that one?
I think it's Jonathan Blow, not Blows.
Jonathan Blow, yes.
Oh, I've played it, The Witness, but I was
The
horrible
Witness,
at that
yes.
one.
Yeah, it was really hard, and that was the thing. Like, I wasn't sure if I was skipping mechanics or not, or what
Mm-hmm.
was going on. And people were like, "No, this is genius." It didn't feel like it was designed. I'm sure it was designed well. Maybe I was missing something. I'm not a puzzle game, but I felt like I could miss mechanics, and
Mm-hmm.
then once I missed one, that was it. Like, I didn't, you know,
Yeah, and especially when it's non-linear. Like if the
it's not
player can
linear
go anywhere and experience puzzles in any order,
order.
and let's say puzzle 8 requires something you need to learn in puzzle 3, but you run to 8 first, the player's gonna have no idea how they're even going to figure this out.
Right. I got out of the first room, right? That
Mm-hmm.
first little area, and then it's like it's an open world puzzle game kind of. And so of course I get to a really hard one first, and I'm like, was I supposed to learn this, or do I need to read a? And I don't really want to read a wiki for a puzzle game because that's not the
Yep.
point of a puzzle game, So
Oh yeah. And once you start reading it, you can't stop, and then you just
that's it.
ruin the whole puzzles for
Ruin the
you.
whole game. Yeah.
And again,
Definitely.
like this is I think another aspect of good level design is that sense of pacing. Like we said earlier, that there has to be wind ups, there have to be cooldowns, and there has to be elements that guide the player's eye. And again, we're not just talking about linear games; we're talking about non-linear ones as well. That there has to be elements that give the player that idea of, okay, I'm going to go over here, or maybe I'm going to go over here first. And there are a lot.
Has to be a reason to keep wanting to move
Mm-hmm.
forward, right? In the open world or the linear world.
Mm-hmm. There always has to be. The player should not be feeling lost. And we see this again in games where there's no sense of structure or personality. That the player goes down 3 corridors, left, right, left, and they're like, okay, where the hell am I going? Did I go.
Corridors.
Yeah, how do I get out of here? And that's like the worst thing. Like, if
Yeah.
your level design is so maze-like, the players don't even know how to get back to where they were, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, I was playing one of the new Quake remastered, and it
Yeah.
has some new additional ones. And I was playing one of the levels, and like you get lost, and then the frustration of getting lost because of the level design is just that's immensely hard to deal with. Like
Yep.
if so.
Oh yes, there have been a lot of 3D based games where, and this is also where cameras come into really big play. How you show the level is as important as designing it. That if, let's say, the camera is focused over here, the player walks and they're following the camera, but the door is in that corner that's off camera, and
Mhm.
the player completely misses it, and then they spend like 30 minutes to an hour wondering where's the way forward, what the hell is going on, and then they just so happen to see that door that had no indication, they're gonna get pissed.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like you've been in the game and you get the key and you press the lever. What did it open? It didn't tell you what it opened. Like it's all it has been opened, but you don't know what opened, and so you're stuck going around to try and find the open one. Um,
Oh yeah, like the best thing out of like Doom 2016 was those retro gates. So you pull the switch and you hear a door open, and just like, okay, where the hell was that
where was
sound?
the door? Where was the sound? And you have your headphones backwards, so
Mhm.
it's the other way.
There you go. And yeah, like the player does not want to feel like the designer is trolling them with their
No,
levels. Like if you're
no.
going to have like vertical challenges or something high up, have like platforms or have something that guides the player's eye to look up and go, hey, maybe there's a door up there or there's a route.
Exactly. And again, you can do that. There's so many different ways you can do that. You can do that with like just assets that you have. You can have like, I don't know, barrels, cones,
Mm-hmm.
lights. Like there's just all colors. Like the way that the corridor is designed can kind of like funnel them to that point. So there's all kind of ways that you can lead the player without telling them where they need to go. Again, like that with color, sounds, I mean,
Hmm.
all kind of stuff.
Yeah, like as an interesting point, when I was playing a Power Slave again, like again, this was a '90s FPS, so it is '90s level design through and through. The first level has destructible walls, so you have to break down the progress. But there is no indication that these walls are destructible. The only way you know is that there is like an explosive barrel that you're supposed to shoot. So
That's right. That's right. There's a barrel right there, and if you shoot the barrel, then you're like, oh, okay. Go ahead.
yeah,
Go ahead.
and I didn't even like I got lost in the first level because I didn't remember like that was a way of guiding the player. I thought there would be like a discoloration in the wall. I thought there would be another
Correct.
path,
Hmm.
but no, like it was just that. And that I think is another big point that when you introduce those simple rules like that, it trains the player to expect that going forward. Because now I know that in, let's say, 5 levels from now, if I don't know where to go, but let's say I see a bunch of exploding barrels next to this wall, I think, well, if the player did on level 1, maybe they're going
Goes
to do
for
it on
level
level
five
5.
for sure. And then when you explode the barrel and it doesn't work, and you're still lost, then you're uninstalling the game.
Yeah, and then you're just like, now what? You know, where the hell is it? It was the other wall that had no color on that you're supposed to know to do something
Right.
else.
Right.
As a time check, I think we are a little bit over an hour 20, maybe a little bit around there. So I think we can probably start to wrap things up. I guess any other points about memorable level design that you can think of?
All I can say is that from a design perspective and memorable design is that of course you have to be considerate of the player. So first off, we start with our character and we make sure that our character is solidified in what he can do, and his verbs and actions, and then we build around that, right? And then the level, in the progression of the level, we have to have a reason to go forward, whether that's through story, whether that's through environmental storytelling, landmarks, etc. But there needs to be a reason to proceed forward into the level. Um, I think that's about it. I think we covered most of it. And of course, just cohesion in the level is really important also. But I think that just covers most of it there.
Hmm. I think the point that I want to end on again is when you're balancing everything the player's move set, the environmental design, the obstacles, and the enemies themselves. Though you again have to be really mindful of what you are expecting out of the player on any given moment. Like one of the things I see from a lot of FPS and even platformers is that if you give the player too much to keep track of, it can become very frustrating to get through levels. Like, here's a really good example the infamous dash. That you can have a dash that you can do in any direction. But let's say that you set the dash to square on your gamepad, but you also have another vital move that's set to triangle. So that if you're trying to push all these buttons at the same time, not only can it become very hard to keep track of it, but there are sometimes cases where it can become painful. Like if you're like contorting your hands to try and hit all
Right.
these buttons at the same time.
Like I'm playing a PS Vita or something.
Yeah. And you gotta be careful again about what you expect out of a player because something that I say a lot, it's very easy to make games at either extreme, either super easy or frustratingly difficult. Like again, with enemy design, Doom Eternal, we could just throw 6 Marauders and 5 Arch Vials at you at the same time. That's a hard challenge, right?
That's a challenge. Yeah.
But again, is it interesting? Is it testing the player in a way that makes sense? And here's my question for everyone watching this, whether it's live or recorded. For those of you who played the Ancient Gods of Doom Eternal, Part 1 and Part 2, which DLC did you enjoy more? For me, I felt the second one, I enjoyed that one more than the first, because it felt like they were doing different things with the enemies as opposed to just ratcheting up the difficulty. While the first one was just more about, again, okay, now we're going to let you fight 2 Marauders. Now we're going to
Now
put,
three. Now four.
and now
Yeah.
we're going to have like spikes spawn around you. And now we're going to make it hard to see. And again, if the player feels like the developer is just, hitting them in the face with a sledgehammer, some players like myself, again, I'm a masochist. When it comes to these things, I will keep playing. But for a lot of people, they're just going to be like, nope, done, uninstall, never play this game again.
Yeah, because I mean that definitely using those tactics shows um, it's one way of game design, but I think it shows a little bit of a disregard for a player's time
Mm-hmm.
and like gamers maturity, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
gamers are not we're not we don't have like one game coming out a month
Mm-hmm.
uh or whatever. So we have a lot of options. And so like definitely like that. Like if you're just kind of like, well, how do we make it harder? Oh, just increase their health and put more of them in there. That's not the best way to do it. It works, but it's more frustrating for the player, and the player's like, my hand hurts. Like,
Yeah.
but so
Yeah, but like my two pet peeves in terms of like breaking rules like that, or if you give the boss regenerating health, or you let them instant or infinitely spawn enemies in.
mhm.
And Remnant from the Ashes, I think, did both of
Remnant,
those, and yeah,
Remnant,
that
yeah.
got
Hmm.
that got frustrating in a few cases. And again, if the player feels like you are giving them challenges that they're not able to either complete because they either don't know or they don't have the abilities to do it, they're going to feel like the game is cheating them and they're going to stop playing. Um,
Exactly.
every once in a while about that new game of Sifu that came out, like I'm seeing a lot of
Yes.
people, I want to play that one. Either I'm going to have to get a press card, I may just have to check it out another way or buy it and play on stream. But I'm hearing a lot of people talk about that one in the good old fashioned, it's too difficult. No, you just have to get good. And, that circle goes around and
Yeah,
around.
I wanted to check that out to do a little combat study on it to see how the combat, because that's what I've been hearing a lot about the combat on Sifu. So I want to check that out, but I think
Yeah.
it's
And we could certainly talk about combat now, but that's another, I think, 2 hours easily.
yeah, definitely
So
easy, easy, easy.
here's the final question then for everyone watching. Any can you think of any good examples or any examples of really memorable levels, like your favorite level in a game from a personality, a mechanical standpoint, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, I definitely love to hear what everybody thinks, and then maybe we could discuss and break down some of those levels and see why what's so memorable about them, what's fun about them, what works, why they work, and then also maybe people can mention levels that they really don't like, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
levels that really stuck out, and we can also maybe talk about that one. That might be a good a discussion in that regard.
Yep. So let us know in the comments down below. I guess for myself, I always go back to the Ravenholm section in Half Life Two as a one of the more memorable and interesting from a mechanical standpoint challenges.
Mhm. Um, for me, let me see. As in level design, um, I think the most memorable. I'm gonna have to cop out on this one. I think there's too many for me
Mm-hmm.
to say. I thought I would have one, but then I was thinking, and I was like, there's so many. It was like I was thinking of like, and some of them veer into like Last of Us popped into my head immediately. Uh, First off, and but yeah, I'll get back to. I'll think about that.
Yeah, and again, we can always. There's still so much more we can talk about level design, so I'm sure this will come back up
Yeah, we
again.
barely even like scratched the surface on it. Like barely
Yeah,
even touched it. Yeah.
and if anyone has again any specific topics regarding level design or anything else in terms of game design, game dev that you want us to cover, let us know. I do not remember
I don't
Click
remember that one
Clock Woods. That
either.
was not easy to
Click Clock
say,
Woods.
but yeah,
Uh,
like dark. The first level of Demon Souls is another one that I always like from a structural standpoint.
mhm, mhm,
And I would
mhm.
say that's one final point again. That's another thing to these cats. I will say one final point 20 times.
20 times. Sin's Fortress.
Yes, that you have to again be very mindful when you're designing tutorial levels and grand challenges. That they're two fundamentally different parts of your game. Like a good opening stage will really set the tone for the rest of your game, And everything should obviously build up towards that final challenge. And if you want good examples of both, again, look at a 3D Mario game. Look at what they test and challenge you on stage 1, and then look at what they test and challenge you on for the final level. And again, when we say final level, we're talking about the final story level. We are
Story
not
level.
talking about Nintendo's Grandmaster Challenge, because that is another nightmare in of
Another
itself.
nightmare. It's fun, and that's the cool thing is that they
Mm-hmm.
can cater to both audiences in that regard. How you were saying is like you can
Mm-hmm.
play the story, right? I can play it with my son, and we can beat it. And then I want to get hardcore and collect all the million stars. You can do that too, and it's an amazingly hard challenge. You're like, I thought I was good at Mario. What the?
Yeah, and then you get all that, and then it's like, oh, you've just unlocked the
You've unlocked
ultimate
something.
level. Here you go,
Yeah,
enjoy this.
masters at that. Masters, man.
And I will hurt my gamer cred by saying that I have yet to finish the Grandmaster level in Super Mario 3D Land. That is like the
Uh,
one Mario that I've not beaten. Like I did beat the final one in Odyssey, and that was a fun
yeah, I
one.
did not. I didn't do the Odyssey one. I did not do that one.
Mm-hmm. But I think we'll wrap things up here. Again, let us know what you think in the comments down below. And we're going to shoot for, again, doing these shows probably around like between like 4 and 5. We'll see where we'll try to figure out a set time that works for everyone going forward. But let us know what you think about the template, the name change, all that great stuff. And for you, Josh, where can people follow you and all that?
Of course, as always, they follow me on my Twitter at casual_scrub. So it's CASUL_scrub. And that's the base place. Everything else links from there. So that's the best place to get me at.
All right, and there'll be links to that into his game Samurai Pig in the
My pig.
description of this chat, and you'll find all my content and links all around this template here. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at GWBlazer. Be sure to join our the Game Wisdom Discord if you're interested in talking about game design and game dev. And as I said, we'll be back next week for another design chat. So again, Josh, thanks for coming on. Hopefully, you won't be hit as much with the winter as I'm sure I'll be in the next few
Hopefully not.
days.
Hopefully not. I'm prepared though. I have propane and food stocked up. We're ready to go. So just in case.
All right. So, with that said, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And until next time, everybody, take care.
Yeah, see you next time.